so happy you're all here to our third conversation exchange with the Raqs Media Collective, who are all three sitting on the bench and will be telling you about all this conversation. I just wanted to beg you to shut your phones or to mute them, because we are recording and we are filming, and parts of this will end up on an app that we're producing, and also perhaps on the website eventually. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Pirana, and welcome to all of you and to our conversationalists on the carpet, to the third Great Bare Mat Exchange. The theme of today's conversation is, what does accumulation do to us? The structure is as before. We invite each speaker to make an opening provocation and then expect the conversation between the four corners to thicken, and we will jump in with our own questions and curiosities. And then we invite the audience to intervene. For those of you who have not been here before, the conversation takes place around the edges of the Great Bare Mat, which is a carpet designed by us as a part of the show that is in the gallery. And this carpet is a snapshot of a conversational process between our three computers in our studio in Delhi and the world of a given day. And it's also, in a sense, inspired by, or takes as a point of reference, bronze mat weights that are in the museum, very ancient objects that were used to weigh down the corners of a carpet so that people could have a conversation on them, which is exactly what we are having. And we are very happy to have our own mat weights, or weighty, weighty mat weights with us, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. You all have you have a note on each of the speakers in the papers that you have, so I won't go into every detail, but very briefly, we have on my right immediately is Bhrigupati Singh, anthropologist and postdoctoral scholar in international studies and anthropology at Brown University. Next on the, I don't know how to say orientation-wise, but the gentleman over there is Cuauhtemoc Medina, curator and writer from Mexico City. Recently, he's curated Manifesta 9 in Genk, a remarkable exhibition we might have occasion to talk about briefly. That's Professor Julie Nelson. She is a feminist economist and at the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And finally, Professor Henri Zerner, art historian, professor in history of art and architecture at Harvard University. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation, and it's wonderful to begin this afternoon. It's nice we have a little more time so things can sort of warm up a little more as compared to the earlier occasions.
We would like to frame the question of accumulation that we're going to be discussing today quite generally as follows. Accumulation has become the most powerful motif and a hugely powerful drive for meaning in contemporary life. It gives power and presence not only to people but also institutions and of course states, various nation states, all nation states. It drives economies, enterprises and individuals. It also brings wreckage in its wake to various forms of life. But at the same time, accumulation is also the mode by which certain curiosities and intensities and obsessions and wonderments or desires can express themselves and in their own wake leave behind for other people a profound impression of the journey through life. I mean, the things that you could collect in that sense. This session today, so we hope that we will revisit some questions around what accumulation can mean, have perhaps some new reflections on that idea, think about its dominance as a value within the present mode of life, which I think we must acknowledge it is, at least in the economic sense, accumulation is the driving value in contemporary existence, and also its power as a form of living. We hope that it will present for all of us, this conversation will present for all of us today a series of speculations and, interestingly, I hope take detours into what value or values or value itself or values can be, which might have got displaced or misplaced along this journey that accumulation has been taking, at least in the recent past. But before we start formally, just a little question, a very personal question I want to ask everyone. When we think about this word, I mean, what do you accumulate? Something to think about as we go through the afternoon. What is it that we all accumulate in the journey of our lives, and how do we think that personally? Tim.
So the exchange and accumulation, like the others on intelligence, on nostalgia, and the forthcoming one on music, are all responses to the museum. And this museum, it's a great accumulation, we could say, and perhaps a kind of a very subjective interpretative accumulation, an accumulation that reflects a personality. And that subjectiveness of what accumulation might mean and how to think about it leads me actually to my first question that I'm going to ask to Julie Nelson, because what we as Raqs Media Collective accumulate most of all, to answer Monica's question, is questions. We accumulate questions. So I'm going to throw out the first question we've accumulated to Professor Nelson. The question of accumulation, Professor Nelson, is central to economists. Mainstream economic theory has, in your words, viewed people as individuals, I'm quoting you, and each individual as self-interested, autonomous, rational, and free to choose amongst different actions. You, on the other hand, have articulated the need from a feminist perspective for a view of people as economic actors, as linked to others, you say, and concerned about their welfare. People who are dependent, emotional, and subject to decisions made by others or influences from the social or natural environment. End quote. With such a network of desires and propensities and even altruisms, as a unit of analysis, what becomes of accumulation? Or do we have to develop a new conceptual infrastructure for economics itself?
That's quite a question. I have to say, when I heard the theme of accumulation, two things resonated. One was being in this museum was the personal level of accumulation. Isabella Stewart Gardner being a champion accumulator in that sense. And in economics, the idea of accumulation of wealth, the accumulation of funds for investment comes up. The idea that you just referred to about the sort of the rational, autonomous actor who's an asocial character fits into a larger view of economics as being about powers and energies and forces that are kind of external to us. So actually, I wanted to turn around one of your questions to you, since you gathered them, about phrasing what does accumulation do to us? Puts us in the passive side of that, which to me resonated with this idea that we're somehow victims or cogs in a bigger economic machine. So is there a better phrasing maybe of why do we accumulate? What is it socially that we do to accumulate? And another question for you is that, are we really accumulating? We tend to think of accumulation in economics in terms of financial and machinery and technology and knowledge accumulation. But some of my own work has been looking at the areas of life that are trying to assume to be kind of continually offering themselves for the use of this industrial society, like the environment or like women's traditional unpaid labor. Have we really accumulated in those, or are we actually depleting some of those stocks by focusing on a narrow pursuit of a particular kind of accumulation?
Rigu, just to carry on this question of accumulation, you have been having a lot of philosophical and anthropological investigation on the idea of frugality as a counterpoint to excess. So we would like you to open this this question around frugality as a opening gambit to other way of looking at accumulation itself.
Thank you. Can I be heard?
Yeah.
So, thanks for the question. In my own work, I've been trying to find a way in thinking about the question of what does accumulation do to us. I've been trying to think about if we can find a way of thinking about these issues in which the moral dice is not already loaded, such that here's evil accumulation, here's good accumulation. So the question that I came to in my own work that I've written a little bit about is that the question of how does human desire come to be attracted to frugality? And I realized that this question has important environmental consequences, important political consequences. The answer that I found was that actually it has a lot to do with the history of religion and morality. Because in some ways, almost every world religion sets out some forms of injunction or different forms in which some form of renunciation or what are called ascetic ideals or asceticism. One of my favorite philosophers, Nietzsche, says that when seen from a distance, the earth is the ascetic planet par excellence. In religions, ascetic impulses or impulses to frugality are often located in relation to some kind of otherworldly incentive, that the hardships of this life will be compensated in some other world, heaven, or some other life. So the question then for me became that, is there any attraction to frugality in a this-worldly ethic? Now, staying with the question of moral ambivalence, I didn't want to say that frugality is necessarily good or necessarily anti-capitalist, because actually the most famous story of the rise of an ascetic ethos actually had a very unintended consequence in terms of accumulation, and I'm thinking here of a classic social theory text, Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which tells us that the rise of a kind of an ascetic ethos on a large scale among a certain kind of Protestant middle class actually created a lifestyle whereby, a very frugal, methodical lifestyle, whereby actually what it resulted in was in these enormous unintended accumulation, which for Weber was sort of the birth of capitalism. So one thing to think about is that frugality is not necessarily good. According to Weber himself, the Protestant ethic from the perspective of rationality, from the perspective of happiness, or eudaimonia as he calls it, was actually quite irrational, in that it turned against all forms of spontaneity, pleasure, excess. Now, some critical theorists or contemporary theorists would say that we now live in an era of late capitalism, in which the value of frugality is actually very low, and spontaneity, excess, enjoyment are turned into a kind of a fetish of some sort. So this kind of led me to a different sort of question, that what is it exactly that's emerging in the place of ascetic ideals? Is it simply some kind of frenzy of accumulation? And is this frenzy actually completely immoral? And this question actually, it led me back to, again, to the history of religion and morality and mythology, which is what my field is to some extent, and led me to a figure also crucial to the history of religions and myths, along with ascetics, that is the figure of the warrior, or a certain kind of warrior ethos, which in religions is often the counterpoint. Ascetic moralities often rise in a contest with some kinds of warrior ethos, as in the case of Buddhism, as against Vedic Hinduism or Christianity with Rome. And a warrior ethos is basically some kind of morality of conquest, where the basic, what is valued the highest is you go out and conquer as much as you can. Different cultures have different versions of this. And it seemed to me that this is not only a mythological curio or some kind of relic, because actually for those, if you talk to like real estate builders in Delhi, or for anyone who studies neoliberal masculine subjectivity, you are faced with these kind of fantasies of world conquest and world domination, which it seems to me reanimate some version of a warrior ethos, of going out and conquering as much as you can. Now, so if we return to mythology, in asking what happens in this form of accumulation, then often mythologically there are basically two kinds of junctures that a warrior comes to. The first is a kind of a sacrificial imperative, in which basically after accumulating a lot, a warrior is faced by the question of what kind of offering can I make? What kind of sacrifice do I offer? And in the case of what is called adventure capitalism, that being one ethos of this kind of warrior morality, then it often in the US, for instance, that offering takes the form of philanthropy. So in the US, there's a great tradition of robber barons becoming great philanthropists, as a kind of what seems to me a theological imperative of sacrifice, or some kind of offering you make after having accumulated. The other major set of stories and mythologies around warriors is based on some kind of some kind of vulnerability of the warrior, which is occasioned by some form of utterly destructive excess. So basically this form of this kind of accumulation can often express itself in a creative form, in some kinds of creative excess, but also in various forms of destruction or destructive excess. And I think for me, in thinking about this question of what does accumulation do to us, I wanted to think about these two forms that I've been thinking about for the last few years, which is ascetic morality, which tends to denigrate desire, and warrior morality, which tends to intensify or celebrate ambition, get rich or die trying, as the 50 Cent song would say. But it seemed to me the conceptual opening for me is that both these are actually morally ambivalent. Asceticism can be creative. There are a lot of forms of creative asceticism, and I think one of the environmental movement right now, one of the most interesting things are non-theological forms of ascetic experimentation with ways of life. But asceticism can also be, or ascetic ideals can also be life-denying, as most famously Nietzsche showed us. Forms of excess can also be joyful. Similarly, with warrior morality, it can be extremely disruptive, this kind of an ethos. But it can also be actually creative, and there's a reason why in so many stories, mythologies, religions, we tell ourselves stories about heroes. Because that is a figure of the human imagination or of human ambition, which I think has been very important, but it can also be a kind of a destructive fantasy. So I think this is what I wanted to pose as basically a kind of two forms or moralities of accumulation that human history has seen.
Thanks, Prabhu, for that very wonderful teasing out of all these ideas. I want to take the conversation forward because although our task is to accumulate questions, it is certainly not to answer them. So I'm going to take Professor Nelson's question and sort of make it meet some of the things that you've just posed to carry it forward onto Professor Henri Zerner. Let's take the question, why do we accumulate, which is how you turned the question around. And I want to sort of intervene and just do a little mischief by adding a third kind of person. You mentioned the ascetic and the warrior. I'm going to introduce the innocent figure, or the not so innocent figure, if you like, of the connoisseur. And that's what brings me to why does the connoisseur accumulate, and to the question for Professor Zerner. To the connoisseur, the act of collecting, hoarding, and holding may have reasons and motivations that are quite apart from that as factored in terms of personal ideas of what is valuable and what is not valuable in the general transactions in the market. So the connoisseur may conquer, but not for the reasons of conquest in itself. So there may be a kind of conquest of the self, if you like. And take Isabella Stewart Gardner. Her collecting proclivity was both related to, as well as autonomous to the dictates of fashion in the market. I mean, if you read her correspondence with Berenson, there's always this tension where he's trying to kind of lure her with an interesting bait. And she sometimes takes the bait, and sometimes she doesn't take the bait. So her collecting proclivity has something to do with her understanding of what is valuable in the market, but also something quite autonomous from it. So can such, maybe, I don't know whether one can call them, but can such, for the moment, let's call them eccentricities of taste, inform our understanding of the subjectivity of the accumulation drive?
Well, first, you talk about connoisseurs, and connoisseur and collector are two distinct issues. Mrs. Gardner was definitely a collector. She was not necessarily a connoisseur. She didn't claim to be, and that's what Berenson was there for. He was the connoisseur, she was the collector, which doesn't mean that he was not an accumulator. He was very much that too. There are collectors of all kinds, and with different reasons, as you pointed out. And I'm familiar mostly with, of course, collectors of art, but that's not the only kind of collection there is. And traditionally, the collecting is based more on the issue of rarity. There are two issues that come in: rarity and also the kind of, for instance, it can be, there were people who collected animals, But it was also, it has been shown that the early collecting cabinets were sort of representations of the world. That people collected all kinds of things, and that they, you know, they created a room which was like this little image of the world, a little cosmos. And that is very interesting, and that would be a way of representing the world for oneself, basically, and eventually, in many cases, bequeathing it to the nation, to the king, or dispersing it, of course, and that is the other the big issue in collecting. You collect for permanence, or do you collect for yourself and then it goes back? So you have somebody like Mrs. Gardner, who collects for herself, but also collects in order to eternalize herself, basically. I mean, the Gardner Museum is the immortality of Mrs. Gardner, and I think immortality, that is the fear of death, is probably one of the most fundamental causes of collecting and accumulation. So then, of course, there's the collecting of institutional collecting. And the modern museum is a particularly interesting case because that is an accumulation which is, to a certain extent, impersonal, although it doesn't mean that it's not subject to fashion, clearly, because, of course, there are individuals involved in fashion plays, but in principle, it is not, that is not its principal aspects. But what is interesting about the main collecting institutions is their unending accumulation, and the fact that our museums are getting bigger and bigger because art used to be, I'm talking about art museums now because, of course, there are museums of science and museums of all kinds of things, but art museums have become more and more collectors of world art. So it becomes absolutely immense, and the Louvre being the biggest, and it's become very unmanageable. There must be something like, I would say, 6 or probably 12 miles of walls in the Louvre. And it's just, you know, nobody can see the whole thing. I mean, maybe you could take a day and just walk around and go in every room, but then you wouldn't see anything. So this sort of magnitude is a real problem, because, of course, collecting always involves responsibility to a certain extent, and of course, cost for a museum, and it becomes totally unmanageable. So it is causing real problems, I think, today. There are collectors who are very, when I was young, there was a collector who was very well known, right in this region, Winslow Ames, was a collector of drawings, and he had a collection of 100 drawings. And whenever he really wanted to buy a drawing, he had to get rid of one. We always thought it was ridiculous. but it is an interesting case. So that's the exact opposite of the gigantic museum. So this is, but I think the issue of responsibility and limits, and of course the issue of whether, which is a very tricky issue in the case of the museum, which is whether they should dispose of things. And in France, as you probably know, it is illegal, which I think is a good thing, because when museums get rid of things, they always get rid of things that are not fashionable, which means that they sell them very badly. I was involved in my early life with a museum in Providence who sold La Vie by Picasso in order to buy a totally insignificant Flemish little fragment. It was very good for Cleveland. And they sold 8 paintings by Innes for nothing, because it was not fashionable. So on the whole, that is not a very good policy. But on the other hand, there has to be some kind of discipline in order to survive. So these are some of the issues.
So there's a question of limits which is being posed, and voluntary limits, but also at the same time it is contesting the idea of not dying, of immortality. And I think this makes me think a little bit, this sort of the fear of dying, the fear of death, the idea of accumulation is kind of, if that is what it is, then what is the ghost in the machine, Fatma? I mean, what is the ghost in the machine of accumulation? And the spirit that you saw when you were, curating coal mine, the exhibition that you made, which looked at such, in such detail at the legacy of coal culture and coal in culture, so both. What kind of specters did you see haunting that capitalism and contemporary capitalism? And we ask this also because we know how much you like ghosts. So it's interesting that we now actually reached phantoms, yes. Phantom specters, let's be more precise, specters. The question of specters haunts us yet again. So, just curious.
No, thank you. I mean, you just made me think on how we categorize those things. And I was keen on bringing on the image, and it's a category of the undead, which is very different than the ghost. Or I think that the undead has a certain corporal quality that one has to somehow look back and think, why is it that the undead is the vampire? And why is it that the vampire is connected with capitalism? And it, in reality, has got to do with something that I was thinking when listening to all of you guys. And there's not my microphone that I don't understand. And it's that I would fear a little bit collapsing the notion of accumulation into something empirical. Oh, this is not going to be, the ghosts are attacking me for not talking about yes, it's about vampires. And so the idea I was trying to hint at is surely there's a big difference between accumulation in terms of objects and capital, and somehow it really has to do with the fact that the capitalist, no matter how powerful this person is, somehow loses his agency in favor of this non-thing. And there is a level in which the question of the old Marxist argument was differentiated in talking about primitive accumulation that was basically, stealing with very different ways or alienating the property of the peasants or all that, from extended or expanded accumulation, had to do with the developing of this agent that doesn't exist unless it's actually growing by reinvestment, by selling, by realizing the capital, that is unable to become a frozen asset. And one thing that is incredibly interesting of what collections are and art collecting is that although it's true that people can sell later on and that we dupe people in the contemporary art market by telling them, look, it's an investment. Is that people froze assets in a symbolic relationship where an art object is pretended or is supposed to mean such and such money, and eventually when you go and pay the insurance, you are actually pretending that that money can be effectively, represented, realized. But what you're doing is somehow dealing with a segment of the representation of capital that is not circulating, that is meant to just stay there, retain its value. What is really beautiful when there's a crisis like this one is that the Picasso is still $50 million. It didn't suffer. Oh, thank you. Should I take this out?
Why not?
Thank you. And whereas the whole question of how capital works, and that is important in terms of what Marx used to call the expanded or the extended capital, extended accumulation moment, is especially that you need to put people to work, extract, I don't know how you call supervalia in English. Surplus value. You need to keep this thing moving, pumping, sucking, getting the blood from the living to remain living. And there was something in Manifesta, to come back to your question, that had to do with a very, I would admit, slightly late, but sort of a perverse question of how is it that you create culture out of this constant process of violent transformation? How is it that you can actually get, in the long term, cultural reflection in objects, understanding them as witnesses and as products of histories, the notion of artworks as historiography, in relation to that violent process where people are experiencing along generations, the violent erasure of their ways of living, the violent appearing of a new way of life, the transformation involved in changes of production. And certainly it was, you can say that somehow the show was trying to deal with artworks as somehow tombstones of that permanent flow. But I was somehow coming, listening to the conversation, I think is going to be very interesting, coming to the thought of how do we negotiate between these two levels? Because somehow coming to what you were saying, I mean, for the sake of the debate, I was taking the position of the devil's advocate, and thinking on the question of why is it that Marx would call this religion of daily life? Precisely because it could seem that all these sacred practices, including art, venerations of different kinds, and today I was just on this mat looking at the vinegar taster. Yes, they are about, in our life, in capitalism, they're about moments that are removed from the general flux of capital, work, market. The different religions, I'm going to just put them in a very democratic way, all of them, as for capitalism, I mean, despite what Weber said, they operate in the same way. They appear as involving that, what you were suggesting, that somebody would be able to have the warrior or the anachorete in a closet. And it's perfectly possible, I was thinking, to be an uber icon capitalist and be absolutely an anachorete. And it is precisely the case, and that is what I think Weber was looking at.
Absolutely,
An abstinate and
I see anchorite.
and as an anchorite, and absolutely frugal. You'll be a very, very thin person that doesn't consume, and you prevent yourself from any expenditure, and you don't waste time in looking at museums, and you could be just be giving people alms. And so how is it that this relates? Because how is it that you put yourself, I'm just saying something in these lines. I somehow felt that it wouldn't be clear to me that finding an ethics of frugality would make anything in relation to the system as it stands. Because this agent, I really believe that people that make money serve this moloch. That, of course, they have an access to this power, but this is a power that is not theirs. That a characteristic, sorry to say this aloud here, of rich people is that they are not free enough to just do. I always have the feeling of looking at them and saying, if you have such money, why is it that you cannot be free for 2 hours and just do whatever? Why is it that you're not ready to do this move of doing something, arrogantly absurd, generous and unthought? And somehow, because I believe that we have two different conditions, that the individual can live under a primitive accumulation logic. You can try to steal this thing, but we are not able to do the other process of actually investing and growing. For that, we need to create this machine that is outside of ourselves. So that's why it is not related. Should that be said?
Annotating it for ourselves.
Absolutely. And I can hold off answering till the next round or whatever you prefer.
This is a question I think that it can be posed, I think, in many ways, but this is one way of posing the question. Is volition such a, is the sense of self, is it possible to separate the sense of self, especially when it comes to the relationship with capital, in any way that gives you a feeling of agency? I'm not sure, anyway, I'll let Brigu answer that, because I think you posed it quite like a devil's advocate, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes. But since we're discussing things that are outside our agency, it'd be quite interesting. Oh, sorry, do you want to come in first?
Well, in relation to that, it poses the question that in any accumulation, the relation between what is accumulated and the self, there's always a reciprocal relation, so that the owner of the accumulation also becomes owned by the accumulation. It's restricting on the self, and it's very striking in some cases. People become slave to their accumulating enterprise. And I just, as much, from what I gather that you were saying, I have to take issue with an idea of an external machine, an agency that is outside, that is in this thing we call capital. There's very long histories of this in the Marxist tradition and also in the classical tradition. They actually both go back to Adam Smith, who talked about a spirit of system. He was writing at a time of the Industrial Revolution when machinery was just fascinating to everybody. It was new. And he used this machine-like metaphors to describe trade and exchange and investment and the rest of this. And I think that metaphor has gotten has taken us on a wild ride. I really don't think there is an external system that has rules. Everybody talks about laws of economics. The classical Marxists talk about laws of accumulation, etc. If you look at the history, it comes from economists trying to look more like physical scientists, because physics has laws, so economics has laws. It also comes from the desire of the people who are winning to make it look inevitable. That's another reason to talk about laws. If we get skeptical about that idea of the external machine, I think about economies as things that we socially create together. I think we open up a lot of different perspectives and opportunities.
So could I respond briefly? Actually, I think I want to disagree with you a little bit and defend Baltimore. But then answer the question very quickly, because I think this is about the undead is very important. I think there is something to speaking about an outside, like Baltimore is speaking, which should be around, from different disciplines. As an anthropologist within critical theory, what a lot of people, one of the more interesting conceptual discussions recently has been about how we consider the category of life. That if we say that, like economists use the term quality of life, then how do we understand what life or vitality means? And if we understand it as something so heart and navy, for instance, say capital does not dominate all of life. So how does one think of that excess beyond capital? I think is a question that people have been trying to think about. And I'm not sure if Baltimore would agree with me fully, but I think he's trying to push my argument into saying how does it build up into a system in which really no one is in control. And the forces and energies, potencies exceed the control of anyone, even of a system. So how does one think about that spillover of life, which could be forms of, I hope we can come back to this because there's actually artwork that Raqs has done called The Capital of Accumulation, which is precisely about this question of life and what is it that exceeds capital or spills over. It's something that we're interested in a lot of work. But just to answer your question briefly, so I wanted to pose the question, but basically I think there is something at stake in how one thinks about life, potencies, energies, which could be the undead, forms of the undead, intensities, which is how I try to think about it, about which are not simply kind of, you can't say this is to do with any one person's agency or any one form of morality. I think there were two kinds of criticisms you were making or provocations you were giving me. One was to say that one could be a warrior and ascetic at the same time. And that absolutely is the case. I'm naming these two impulses. So if we say they are like something like what Freud calls Oedipus complex, then it's a moral impulse or some kind of mythological figure which is a kind of an impulse in the human psyche, which can very much exist alongside other forms of other impulses. So it is precisely a mixture of, you find Indian capitalists particularly always talking about how frugal they want to be, how much charitable giving they do. So it is very much a question of how these impulses are mixed with each other. But in naming them, we understand, I think, two different impulses or two different forms of morality which you find in religions, in cultures across the world. These are extremely global figures, ascetics and warriors. These are the most common shrines in South Asia and China. So there's something to the mythology of these categories which gives us a way of thinking about them, but in the lived experience, obviously they'll be mixed. To say that there is no agency, I think would be wrong, because one of the things that's interested me is how one thinks about when something like frugality becomes a political issue. And so for me, a figure I've been interested in are people like Gandhi or Thoreau, for Gandhi, for instance, to stop wearing a particular kind of cloth disrupts the British Empire, to stop using salt, suddenly changes the entire forms of relation in which you're embedded. So it takes, I think it is an act of creativity to imagine what, it's not to say that, as I said, frugality is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily political, it's not necessarily anti-capitalist. But there are forms in which it has been used by creative thinkers, not only in religions but in very secular battles, in which some form of a creative intervention involves a specific act from which maybe you withdraw your consent from an economy by showing that you're stopping the usage of this particular thing. So there are forms in which creativity can be expressed, and it's not simply that you're caught in a system where you just have no say. On the other hand, I do want to defend the idea that there is some way of thinking about life or energies or intensities which are not simply controlled by capital. So I don't know if that... Absolutely.
Can we think of getting back to oikos as this kind of space of life and think of economics as engaging with sustenance and with regeneration? So if it is about thinking about the world of space of life, sustenance, regeneration, then how would you engage with these forces and potencies that are being outlined here?
If I may just sort of supplement that by saying that, I mean, I think what you're raising is a very interesting question of not succumbing to the temptation of thinking about the outside, that these decision-making processes are in some senses outside volition. But if one has to think from the inside, how would one think?
Yeah, these both tie into what I want to respond. When I say that there isn't an outside mechanical thing, I'm not saying I can snap my fingers and change everything just out of magic. But what I'm saying is that what we see as economies, what we see as capital are emergent systems. That is, they come from the individuals, they come from the societies. And there is no outside machine that is somehow shaped one way or another by society. It comes out of the society. So yes, there are systems larger than us, but in a lot of the mainstream and Marxist thinking, there is a sort of society over here, and we've got economy over there, and then maybe there's colonization, and various bad things going on. No, I mean, the economy really grows out of society. You're talking about the focusing economics on the regeneration and these sorts of things. A lot of people have defined the field of economics as being about markets or about rational choice behavior. That's very popular among the academics. And I think you get a much different view if you think of define economics as how societies organize themselves to provide provisioning, provide for survival and flourishing. That brings in a whole lot of things that are non-market, brings out a whole lot of things that are coercion rather than choice, etc. On this idea, particularly of regeneration and of preservation, I wanted to play off your work on the heroes and the warriors. I recently just finished a piece called Is Rejecting the Precautionary Principle the Manly Thing to Do? Precautionary principle is in environmental and ecological circles the idea that natural systems are complex enough that we should think about it before we go in with our technologies and do something that could have lots of unintended consequences. Among economists, mainstream economists, it's widely poo-poo. You know, we're in control, we know what we're doing, economic growth is going to continue forever, technology will save us. These precautionary principle people are just being fuddy-duddies, whatever. But the more I explored that, the more I saw a motif emerging, which is the economist's self-portrayal as the hero, the person who goes forward, who conquers. The portrayal of the precautionary principle people as the old wives, the personification of superstition, the impoverished old woman in the hut in the forest. And actually a good deal of some of the ecological responses to the mainstream do follow that. They prize wilderness over all sorts of civilization. You know, if economists are for growth, you have to be anti-growth. If economists are global, you have to be local. And some of that's kind of retreating to the forest hut. It plays right into this dualism between hero going forward and retracting. And I think the frugality is in there as well. That old wife, the kind of retracting small hut forest as opposed to this going forward industrial whatever. But I like to think about what I think of as the off-diagonal. The hero is sort of the masculine positive portrayed force, and the old wife is the sort of feminine negative portrayed force. What if we think about a feminine positive and a masculine negative force? There's about a couple characters there that are interesting. The negative, the masculine hero is what I think of as the reckless fool, or to be more precise, the teenage driver. Okay. Someone who is so going forward and so out there that they're running all sorts of crazy risks. And, you know, more seriously, mainstream economists that are now advising the US on climate policy are teenage drivers and are ready to drive us off the cliff. On the positive side, what about the wise grandmother? The person who has lived through some floods, who's lived through some hurricanes, who knows that you better prepare, that maybe you don't always go charging off. She's not sitting in a hut, you know, telling people that, you know, breaking glass is going to give them 7 years bad luck or superstition. But someone who is wise and preserving and longer viewed than this hero. The idea being that what we need is a balance of the hero, the going forth, and the wisdom and the long view. That either this, and in terms of frugality, it's this balance between the poverty of the old woman in the hut and the warrior who's out there just amassing the stuff, getting those balances. So I wanted to add a couple more characters to the people we've got out here.
Just as an anecdote to throw into this, is that, I mean, I read in a book recently on the work of John von Neumann, who's this kind of game theory analyst and pioneer, about the work of the Rand Corporation thinking about, let's say, nuclear how to build a nuclear deterrent. And the model that they were using, incidentally, was that of two teenage drivers speeding at each other on a one-way highway.
Playing chicken, yeah.
Or playing chicken, and who would back out first. So it's very interesting that actually the teenage driver has actually figured as this heroic figure in game theory analysis of world events.
Can I also throw in an anecdote? I was just thinking about, since we've been through hurricane and since we've raised this topic, when the tsunami had come on the east coast of India, this was a few years ago, the big tsunami, then the Andaman Islands, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, are the islands that were very much in the wake of the tsunami. And there's a community of people who are called the Jarava, who are indigenous people who have made who've tried their best not to be integrated in any form. So they've been studied by anthropologists, but they still maintain some kind of traditional integrity and are fundamentally hunter-gatherers. They're still living in certain kind of frameworks. complicated, but fundamentally that is the case. And it's really interesting because when the tsunami came and wiped out pretty much what was, Port Blair, what is Port Blair, and many of the kind of contemporary sort of city or towns of, there was not a large number of people, a number of people were injured, died, all sorts. Not a single Jarawa person lost his or her life because there had been an oral culture of the fact that when the sea behaves like this or when the sky looks like this, this is the time to leave and go back. And this leave the shore and go to the tree, literally go inland, and that is exactly what happened.
The last tsunami would have happened 150 years before.
Yeah, we're talking about
somebody has a long memory there.
Someone has a long memory. I was just reminded of that.
Right.
Thinking about
Social long memory, not just a personal.
Not just a personal long memory. So the wife's grandmother is also living in a forest in the hut, and that's an interesting sort of coming together of both figures. But thinking about this question of how, well anyway, I'm trying to make a connection which may not be there, but wait a minute, I think I've lost the question that I was going to ask.
Can I say something?
Yes.
It's maybe because I come from a plateau and we don't have hurricanes and tsunamis. I might make a point about the building of volcanoes and things like that. What I think that your dichotomy you're making, which is useful, has a problem in relation to the question of accumulation. Because the question of accumulation involves the production of an exteriority along hundreds or thousands of years. So the fact that we have cities, for instance, means that there's an investment where lots of resources and many people's work along the time have produced a certain stability of resources there. Wealth has been accumulated and put together in those places, and there is a certain level of powers that derive from that exteriorization. And somehow what I feel is that without you allow, not for the encountering of the machine that is external to you, but the fact that civilization is about the production of an exteriority of powers that accumulates along history. That this accumulation, in particular under capitalism, is a transgenerational project and enterprise that has now involved the whole world population, who is working together, not in this generation, but since the 17th, 18th century, in the building up of these enormous wealths that need to be reinvested as capital, to be reintegrated as power, and that only lives from the fact that it has to be realized in the market in terms of price. Then, of course, you have the feeling that society is about individuals that distribute wealth amongst themselves. Somehow I'm saying that it feels strange to me not to understand that the logic of the society along history that differentiates what the West is and how it has become the world economy is that of the production of this external device. If you want to see it under a metaphor of a machine or an aggregate, I'm not by now a social scientist, I'm a stupid academic, but you need to be able to actually understand it as, and again, I know it's the wrong vocabulary, as an alien to the individuals that are agents to it. And I'm going to bring this argument out of economics to make a very simple point, because it's going to be a way to make it clear if I make it sound ridiculous. I'm an agent of the Mexican state. I know that you don't think yourselves on that line, but I know that I'm an agent of the Mexican state. And I'm an agent of the Mexican university with you. And that enterprise happens to be 500 years old. And I belong to that object. I cannot control it. It's not a matter of a contract, free or non-free got involved as a set of norms that I adopted. No, it's an entity. And it's a ridiculous entity. I cannot speak of a most ridiculous entity than the Mexican state. I'm an agent of that. I know that your states tend to be more significant, so you don't necessarily think about it too much because it's not as ridiculous as mine. But I will be very, very resistant to reduce my relationship with you unless to a situation of you and me and the distribution of resources between us, unless I can see that this agent forced me to be part of a certain knowledge that is very powerless with you here. Like, I know what are the points of your route. And that's a resource that actually is involved in a certain field of power and cultural relations. Now, let me go back out of the cartoon that is Mexico, that allows us to put these things in a very clear way. I'm basically saying that in order to understand why is it that we need to keep on describing this thing as undead and bigger than any of us, and standing there as something that we are serving in different positions, at different positions of power. Some of our positions actually involve the possibility of giving orders, other positions involve the possibility of withdrawing into our cultural world as we do. Other positions involve having to be from morning to night, if we are lucky, making breaks, and if we're very unlucky with nothing, has to do with the fact that we need to render it as an external production that is long term, that is not something that we can actually transform with any contractual decision. So somehow I feel that we need to be able to make a distinction between those two things, I feel, unless the whole question of accumulation stops being important in any way. It's just a matter of degrees of wealth.
Oh, then already. Because I didn't want to lose one, because it's very unusual to meet an economist who can think mythologically.
I'm afraid you're right.
Whenever I can jump back, and I just wanted not to lose the reckless old fool and the wise grandmother, which does relate to, I think, a store of knowledge or something like a storehouse of something that got more.
And also, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. You never meant that there was no system, right? You just meant that it is a machine which is made by us.
Yeah,
and that consequently that machine can be acted upon as well. Not that you or me can change the machine, but still it is a machine that is accessible.
A process,
an organism. So there is a give and take between the machine that is working on us and us on the machine, if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, I tend to prefer notions of process and organism to machines and mechanics. But the idea that we have these interactions.
But insofar as the metaphor of the world as a machine is at the basis of it, the world as a machine is completely independent, so to say. I mean, we're not going to change the solar system. That has a sort of independence. What we're talking about is social systems, right, which are produced by society. That's very different from the machine, the physical machine of the world. No, it's not totally. Well, of course, it's not totally independent because we are part of it. We are part of it, but still we can change social systems in a way that we cannot really change. The word machine. So,
no, I'm just, it'd be interesting for a moment to just take it out of the sort of the more meta kind of discussion that we're going into, because you talked about also like how you can also be a slave to the collection. I mean, there's an interesting kind of, just to think about it in terms of something much smaller, which is say a collection, which is also kind of a set of things that have been accumulated, and according to you, they can also drive you, even though you think that you might drive them. So. I know we will get back to the mythic and all that, but I'm just curious about, because if you take it into this kind of much smaller domain, the question of, I would be curious, for example, that can there be a dark side to this collection? We've been discussing the dark side of one kind of accumulation. The dark side to the idea of collecting at that scale. I mean, it was phrased quite well here. Can the accumulation of an artwork for its own sake occasionally represent a danger to the work of art? Just to think it in a different sort of
A
formulation.
danger to the work of art, because there are two aspects: the danger to the work of art, and also danger to the individual.
Yes, both. Both of them I think are quite pertinent especially in the context of the larger discussion that we are having, because it's as much about how one can enact in the world, so that one can be part of the sort of larger idea of making and becoming, which is at the same time being connected to a sort of system of the collection itself.
Yes, well, clearly, as I said before, the accumulation imposes responsibilities, and there is a point when the accumulation sort of oversteps the responsibility of the collector, so that just simply physically the physical collections cannot be controlled and preserved. So there is clearly a danger there, and that is particularly true of museums that have collections that are too large to really take care of, so they accumulate. Also, the issue of fashion. I remember, I mean that's totally anecdotal, but when I was briefly a curator in Providence, and I found that there were paintings by Benson, who was totally disregarded American painter, that were leaning against heating pipes because they had a lot of stuff, they couldn't take care of it all. As it happens, these things were worthless at the time, very expensive, so now they're being taken care of. So that is the kind of thing, I mean that's an example of the kind of thing you are. The danger to the private, I mean, you're already in the 17th century, Labrien, who does a very satirical view of the collector, says, there's a collector, for instance, he says, I'm in real affliction because I have almost all the works of Calderwood, and I'm only missing one, and it isn't really very good, but I can't make it complete. And clearly there's a sort of action, it's a psychological action on the collector, but it is really making the collector miserable. So that is the kind of action. And I'm sure there are similar themes in the larger world where that act upon the self, upon the individual self.
So this psychic energy perhaps is back to the question of myth. I mean, what kind of, so do you want to talk a little bit about the fool and the wise grandmother?
The fool, no, I got sidetracked in your question was so beautiful that I did want to ask you that don't you think there is a danger if we think about, sorry, I'll come back to the rental school, but there is a danger in, can you just repeat the question again?
Well,
is there ways in which objects have a meaning?
Accumulation of, and I meant that in a much more...
that is a danger to the work of art itself.
Accumulation of artwork become a danger to the work of art itself, and not only the artwork, but the work of art, like the question of what the work of art itself is, which I think that's why I was connecting it to the larger discussion that we're having.
I think there's a very, very clear example in one issue that has to do with MoMA. I think that's, because I don't think it's too much with the Louvre, that MoMA accumulates well beyond any plan or will of exhibiting ever. So in the long term, what happens in MoMA is that they actually have collected many artists, many countries, many periods, in order not to show them ever. As if one of the policies of MoMA, and I'm talking about that specific institution because it's not the same with other institutions, actually does buy those things so as to prevent their circulation or exhibition. And it's very clear in relation to Latin American art in the long term. But indeed, it is very specific of a certain moment when the institution is not able to connect those two things. It's not happening all the time. I would say that Louvre, despite what everyone can say about it, has a purpose that they are actually enacting the nostalgic power the universality of France, and it works well for that. And I think that the Louvre is a very important as to what the French economy is. They can speak about nuclear weapons because they have a Louvre. I really believe that. But it will be difficult to explain. But in case of some collections, I think that works of art suffer from loneliness, invisibility, and silence because of that.
That is very true, yes. But that is true in general. It's not just true of museums. The accumulation of works of art, to a certain extent, always hides them. There's no question about that.
But my question, actually my counter question to you had been that just to follow that thought a little further, was that there's something, one of my philosophical heroes, Nietzsche, who's clear by now, says that connoisseurs are Philistines. Connoisseurs are Philistines. Because what they do is fix the order in which things are arranged. So there's a way in which the history of art is taught, and I think about it for myself as a social theorist, there's a way in which the history of social theory is taught, that actually deadens the way in which one understands or engages when you understand something through a progression of isms. That's one way in which we introduce someone to a work of art. But that same arrangement also simultaneously could deaden or remove the life potency.
Yes.
So my question would be, in what ways do we restore potency back to, for me, for text, how do you bring a text back to life? Or how do you bring an artwork back to life? Because there's a particular danger in the way it can be arranged, where it just ossifies our understanding of what that is.
Yes. And that
question of potency
yes.
that we've been
No, I understand your question. And that is an important issue. And there you have to think of the work of Foucault insofar as something, in order to be significant, has to be placed into some kind of framework. That is, if all things are possible, then nothing is in fact enacted. So that in order for a work to have meaning, it has to be placed in one of these systems. It can be chronological, it can be an aesthetic system, or whatever. Now, how you switch from one to another is a very, and I don't think that there is an answer except that outside of circumstances. And it gets back to the general question. Probably it is the changing social system that reopens, and we have seen within my lifetime spectacular. There's a whole range of 19th century art which was completely invisible in my view, and I was part of a generation that reopened it. And how is it done? Well, it was partly simply because sort of at a very basic level, people of my generation looked at what was in my 19th century, which was completely invisible, and we said, why? How come these things were highly praised and we don't see them anymore? So the first thing was to see them again. So they had to be, insofar as they're not being destroyed.
The question can be put more crudely by saying, how do you save a museum from museumization?
I wanted to come in on this.
I think simply time, and this is why preservation, we have to destroy a lot of things, because if we kept all the works of art, it would be totally impossible to see anything, to understand anything. There were, in Paris, there were about I think something like 6,000 painters in the 19th century at any time producing paintings. If we had all that, we wouldn't possibly be able to make anything of it.
This is an issue about fashion and what actually gets going on display. I found quite interesting. It also relates back to some of your questions to me.
So,
I'll be interested in what, I just have this feeling that at least to some folks there's something called art with a capital A, or good art. and that's a separate category from bad art, and you put what's on it. And it was very interesting, hearing talk about fashion, that these things come in and out. And to me, that idea of art with a capital A is what Alfred North Whitehead would have called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. What we actually have is artwork. If we create this category called art, that's something a little different. And your sort of challenge to me, I probably do make you feel uncomfortable, because one of the things I'm challenging is the idea that there is this thing called exteriorization with a capital E, or capitalism with a capital C. There is certainly history, there are certainly things going on, but what actually, what we create out of that and what we call it can often get in our way of actually observing what's there. So I think, economics is culture, culture is economics. This fashion is going to describe who gets rewarded and who's actually able to have the time and resources to do their artwork. So there's going to be this back and forth continually between our sort of resource base and the cultural base. And I want to bring up concrete, you brought up Mexico as an example, the example of money. Often when people think of the economy as being something external, they think of money as this external power. Actually, money is fashion, literally. If you look at a Federal Reserve note, it says, it's not a silver certificate, it doesn't tie you to gold, there's nothing concrete behind it. It is money because the Federal Reserve says it's money, and because we agree that it's money. If we stop agreeing that it's money, and this happens in a lot of countries with civil war, with inflation, with other things like that, if people suddenly stop believing it's money, it's not money. As soon as people stop taking an exchange, it loses complete value. Money is fashion in the same way that this art is fashion.
Gold standard was true.
There was something, behind it, but we haven't had a gold standard since the 1940s, And so it is, and that is sort of this whole idea of there being these kind of capital M entities that are in our life, I think. At least there's some skepticism. And maybe art and money could be two interesting ones.
Yes, and the capital is a word. It is a way of understanding something which is not really.
Sure, well, we have to make generalizations and use metaphors and use these terms all the time. It's when we start taking them too seriously and believe that they're somehow primary to what we observe that we're in trouble.
Just to take that a little further and push you a little on this, because I think I hear you expressing the reservations of the skeptic that are very valuable. But I want to hear a more substantive account of what remains when the fashions come and go. And I am thinking a little bit about, you already brought up standing. The hurricane came and went, and there's a certain permanence with which things come. There's a certain permanence and an impermanence with which nature acts. And on the one hand, we're talking about what we hold in custody for future generations. So I'm thinking that if, let's take the start as your assumption that we have only what we have right now to begin with. I'm with you on that question, that we have to work with what is the interior rather than the exterior. And given that the hurricane comes and goes, how do we build? My question basically is, you talked about an economics that is sensitive to the questions of climate change. How does one actually build the structures of that economic theory?
I think one starts by asking different questions. Really, questions that are very good. In conventional mainstream economics right now, climate change is framed as a question of how would an ideal social planner who knows the preferences of everyone in the world, knows the stream of future GDP, et cetera, design an optimal policy to price things just right now to get a permanent stream. And then there's all sorts of bizarre technical things, and this looks very intimidating, so no one is supposed to criticize it. The better question is, how do we want future generations to live? What kind of life do we want now, and what kind of life do we want for people in the future? Starting with that question, rather than starting in the position of this omnipotent social planner, are two very different ways of coming at this question.
I think it's maybe an interesting moment to see if anyone else wants to join into the discussion of what, I'm sure everyone has a lot to say on over here too, but maybe we can do this in dialogue with with other questions that might come in. This is a good starting point.
We'll take 2-3 questions.
Okay, we can take 2-3 together.
Hi, I think that a really nice allegory to most of the topics we discussed is a phenomenon, which is fashion, which is like a phantom, it's capital, it's a wire, it's interest, and would be like the internet. And it's like, it's besides history, in my opinion, one of the most particular fragments of accumulation itself, which is actually like a paradigm because it's non-physical, which brings back to me like this phenomenon of being a phantom. But the way you capitalize it is, and right, the question will be like, what do you think in the future is going to be filtered? Is it going to be like an archive of the internet itself, or is it going to be like a sales compulsive mechanism of development, which is going to be like accumulation in accumulation itself?
Well, I wanted to, I had a different question, but one of the things that your question raised is really interesting. I've been obsessed lately with the expansion of the word curator. And one of the things that's really interesting as I was sort of using the internet to sort of see the expanse of the term is that in fact there's a whole field of information technology now that is about curating and archiving the kind of sea of data on the internet, a sea of pages, and this sort of history of websites and everything like that, and it's a whole sort of separate. And I was so fascinated that it's curating digital technology, that's the word, in fact, that's being attached to it. So anyway, that was just a thought. But actually, I wanted to ask a question that for me comes out of a memory, because we've been talking here about accumulation and even asceticism as somehow assuming that what's accumulated has a value. And I used to live in New York City, and of course this is a typical story that you hear, and I experienced it, that the woman across the hall from me passed away, and when her family went in to clean the apartment, it was just filled almost to a psychotic degree with newspapers, old copies of the New York Times filled the room. And this doesn't conform to any of the models, mythical models, say, that were put up here. But there is a sense in which, or I might have missed it, but there is a sense in which this idea of the accumulation of the absolutely worthless seems to kind of act as, I don't know if it's a counterpoint, or I don't know if it's the sort of undead, I don't know what that becomes or how one would think it, but I think that there's certainly, even in literature, one could think of those sorts of moments coming up.
Maybe we can start. I'll just
No, I think that it's interesting, the contrast between the questions, because it somehow has to do with the importance I think that the internet has in actually, it's going to force us to understand that immaterial things are much more important as agents that we live. And I'm not being spiritual in any way. I'm just saying that precisely what is, I think, really, really important there is that for the first time, in relation to something that is not just God or money, people are dealing with something that, in experience, they cannot touch all the time. So the classical dichotomy, I think that some of our discussion is inhabiting of trying to fixate reality to something that is empirically present physically should start to vanish. So I'm somehow trying to come from that thinking that worthlessness. I believe that, I don't know the case, you need to analyze each this agent that that woman was producing was interlocked with her is not a mental thing. There was something that was being done as we are doing something with this mattress here. And I mean, the way we normalize, we justify, we conventionalize weird relationships in the West in the last 200 years has been precisely work of art, and we negotiate with them agencies that we are not able to map and define with the others, but we share, and we allow ourselves to have agencies that we don't share prima facie, and we need to learn how to face them, and in a certain way that always poses the artwork as a good model to describe that fluctuation between absolute worthlessness and transcendental importance. So somehow the figure I would like to bring is that of imagining that, and it doesn't need to have to do with accumulation, but that there is a certain level in which that dirt is involved in what people make of themselves or how they are made by those things. It's clear that there was no space so as to socialize that experience. I mean, the difference between an artist and that woman is that we have an institutional framework that forces on others the question of, so why is it that I need to live with boys? And why is it that I need to give credence to the things that he's claiming? And then I'm forced to think, oh, felt, yeah, should be worn, and has to do something. I'm really meaning it in a very, 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 very literal. I mean, we are forced to actually sit on the mattress of the Raqs and think that something is going to happen. And something happens. So that worthlessness is institutionalized. It really has to do with a moment when we need to be allowed to interlock with that space. And yeah, it's very interesting to me that we are going to have to start finding a way to indulge into some of those material communications.
I'll just give a good example of artwork by Kavakov, with Man Who Threw Nothing. It is just a collection of hundreds of fragments, partial objects, broken things, but kept and especially, and then made in the work is released in mid-80s. It completely becomes a very strange landscape of half-finished conversations that he was having over 40 years. So in or Songdong's work, which MoMA showed, was 500 toothpaste caps, thousands of soap things the mother kept for 30 years, and she was shifting from house to house. Linens, 100 linens, you know, kind of plastic covers for things which are completely worthless. But when it's shown in the context of an exhibition of trying to recover form of life that people have in secret lived in China post-cultural revolution, during and after, then it takes on a completely different resonance and structure. So
yeah.
That.
But there is also the issue of the stifling aspects of accumulation that goes back to the newspapers. Now, somebody might take all those newspapers and make an environment with it, whatever. But on the other hand, it's a good image because if we keep everything, then it kills us. There's no question about it. We have to get rid of things. Perpetual accumulation is death.
So I think some of what you've been thinking about are creative destruction.
Yep.
Forms of creative destruction.
Yep.
Except for the social system that is actually perpetually accumulating beyond everybody's death. And I'm skeptical.
Yes, but it also has its way of evacuating. It is not sort of constant, and this is, I think, in economics, the fallacy of the idea of perpetual growth, which
Well,
is...
I found it kind of odd, the idea that the internet is ephemeral. The internet actually involves some like football-sized buildings,
Yeah,
cooled
yes,
with
there's
large
a
amounts of
very
energy,
real
filled with
material.
yes, and dumps are filling up
And
with
cost.
planned obsolescence of all of our computers and our iPads and everything
And
over
cost
time.
and all kinds of...
There are, there's some kinds of, I think you're right that there has to be a dynamic of accumulation and decumulation, that there are vastly different ways
Oh,
of
sure.
doing that. Yeah.
What are preferable ways?
There's a question here. And then Jason.
Yes, I just wanted to raise an issue about accumulation in sort of two different dimensions. One is the accumulation that creates. So there's the building of new units. For instance, we've accumulated this new wing of the Gardner that lets us use it in different ways. There's the accumulation of knowledge where it builds over time. There's accumulation of infrastructure, etc. And with some exceptions, you can think of this in part of building capacity to lend meaning or convenience to lives over time. The other part of accumulation is the accumulation collecting objects that already exist. So the museum that pulls together, it's not creating new things. It may in some cases be creating new ways to pull together and seen and understood. But I'm particularly interested in that if you look at the issue around archaeological sites. The push by individuals and science museums to accumulate has important sites being robbed of those artifacts. In the process, the context is lost so that we lose knowledge in the process. So these two kinds of accumulation, one that sort of creates and one that may concentrate and illustrate the past or may be destructive at the same time. And I just wanted to throw that out.
Can you pass your mic to Jason? Then I'll stay up here.
Jason, please.
Hello. This conversation just brings up a couple of things for me. My work kind of deals with the fact that the things that you consume at some point in time consume you. And I was just thinking about like how the human exchange used to be the currency, and how in the digital era, like things have kind of changed in terms of the currency becoming material things. And I just read somewhere that in social media we're making updates to what we think are our closest friends while we're dying in isolation.
There's another question here.
So thank you for this really fascinating conversation. There's one thread that I wanted to pick up on, and that's the difference between wealth and accumulation. And I think that, and I came in a little late, so I don't know if Bifo Berardi has already been mentioned, but he has a brilliant formulation that wealth is the time to enjoy the things you have, rather than to accumulate, which actually deprives you of any enjoyment of what you have. And along those lines, he also, and this is to you, Brigitte, rethinks Deleuze and the notions of intensity and desire, and argues that desire is a field rather than a force. Right? So therefore, to think of it as somehow outside of or intense, he tries to rethink the ways in which that very thought has been so central to this rethinking of accumulation.
I just wanted to drop two bibliographic references that I think are useful for thinking about this slightly differently. So one is not by Marx, who's been mentioned a lot today, but by Engels. I'm not quite remembering the title of the essay, but it's something like the role of labor played in the something from ape to man. So this sense of, right, a member of the proletariat is born, I might be massacring this, but, and is told by everyone around them, oh, rich people built this city, God built this church, etc. And so Engels says, no, poor people built this church, built this city, that actually what you're seeing around you that's being presented to you as the kind of patrimony and accumulation of wealth was actually produced by the working class. I think that's an interesting perspective to bring in when we're thinking about the work of art, right? Or thinking of labor as a term within a conversation about accumulation. And then another, which is, I'm not going to pretend to paraphrase and I haven't fully read, but is this recent Timothy Mitchell book, Carbon Democracy, with a thesis that I'm going to also butcher, but which is, did carbon produce our concept of democracy? Which is a question that I think comes up in this discussion about where is the agency left amidst this culture of accumulation. Not to kill that conversation, but to say, oh, is our concept of agency in fact dependent on that accumulation historically, which I think would be hard to argue with.
It's a very interesting question. I think it's time some responses came and then we'll see if we have more time.
Could I make one quick response to Wendy? So in thinking of desire as a field, not a force, and of thinking about wealth, as you say, not simply as expenditure, one of the topics that we were discussing a lot before you came, I think you might have, I'm not sure if you missed that, was around frugality and excess. You were there. So how we think of creative forms of frugality. And I just wanted to flag a figure I've been quite drawn to in thinking about this. Julie raised this idea of living in a forest hut. And what a figure I've been drawn to is Thoreau, who has a very interesting definition of wealth. And Thoreau, he says, it's not that our demands on nature are too much, it's that precisely we don't demand enough of it. And he's trying to show a form of intensity or demand in which one can understand a different mode of what wealth could be or what expenditure could be. And he's constantly returning to themes of extravagance. And he says, it may seem to you I'm living in a hut, but I'm actually living the most extravagant life possible. And it to some extent, it's not simply a cosmog. I imagine you might be feeling a bit skeptical about this. But even for the most, even from a Marxist point of view, not to say that either of us are from, or there can be any such thing as a Marxist point of view. But if you think about what Marx's famous passage in Capital is about what life will look like after the revolution, I go fishing in the morning and hunting. I think it does have something to do with, in a way, Thoreau is an instantiation of that life. And is trying to show some different definition of how we might conceive of value. And I think a lot of the questions that we've been circling around have to do with in what way we attribute value, or how we might measure value in ways that's not necessarily of money. And which is not to say that there's no source of value, but to examine what the source of that value may be. Whether it's the transformation of value through an artwork, where something that was nothing becomes something of great value, or other forms in which we might understand the way in which value is produced, or surplus value is produced.
I really want to second the idea that there's questions of what is really of value to us versus what we may end up consuming or accumulating. But I have to point out, Thoreau spent severe winter nights in Emerson's kitchen, in a much more substantial house, and I believe also had laundry done by the women in Emerson's household, or his mother, or someone like that. So, I think that the values are there, but let's not idealize the person in the hut to the extent we forget about things like warm fires.
I mean, this is like a very New England inside joke. Everyone has a story about how Thoreau was not actually frugal. That's not what is interesting to me about Worden. Is a classic, not because, he was actually hiding and his mother was pressing his shirts and all that. That's true, and he's not saying, he says that I live precisely, I live 1 mile away from my nearest neighbor. Precisely because he wants to be seen and wants to be a part of normal life, and is trying to show you. So it's not an idealization necessarily, and the kind of typical Bostonians, whatever, the skepticism, very, very American skepticism, and this is part of how actually appreciation can actually kill a work. Because for me, who had never read Thoreau in school, or as every American school child reads these texts, they gradually get deadened. And for me, this is one of the ways in which it's been deadened, is to actually tell you the inside story about Thoreau. Anyway, just to defend. just to defend, it's not an idealization, it's a question of how value is produced.
Point taken.
So, anyway.
I think we might, well, since you've spoken so eloquently, I think we might, unless someone has a question, did anyone else have anything to add? We might consider this sort of lots of things to chew upon and take back with us.
Any last words?
There is one last word. Great.
I had a question about once the accumulation is made and put into the public sphere, how that affects us as the general public. And if accumulation is knowledge and history and intelligence is made from the bits of the collection, those collections are usually privatized, whether it's personal or institutional or from the government made. And I was just wondering if the public is entitled to an unbiased view of that accumulation.
Well, now we can take another hour. That is really a big question. In the world of art, of course, there are very different cases. Some accumulations are just dispersed, in which case as you probably know, collectors are totally favorable to that solution, because if everything goes into the public sphere, then there's nothing, presumably, ultimately there would be nothing to collect anymore, which is of course a fallacy, because first of all, some things are made, but there is a point, that is that the circulation of goods or value, and value attached to them is an important aspect. To what extent does the public profit, which is I think what you were talking about, right? Well, Mrs. Gardner is a good example, right? She left her house and collection to the public with very strong strictures. That is, it was for the public, but it was also for her survival, for the public to really appreciate her value in all eternity. So that is one aspect of the. So it's complex. Now, she could have given it to the Boston Museum, right? And she would have sort of disappeared. And the question is, what would be preferable? Would it be better to have the sort of general collection improved, but some things and her disappear? So the solutions are very, very complex. And also, there's the issue of the agencies that handle these accumulations. That is, an accumulation itself does not profit the public unless it is in some ways either displayed or, you know, if it is an accumulation, because it's not the art. There is, for instance, charitable institutions. That is another kind where people accumulate money and they give it to an accumulation and to an institution. It can be, you know, for a dog hospital. That's very different from a kitchen for the poor. So it's a very, very complicated, issue of how accumulations are disposed of eventually. And as I said, we then, you know, if we wanted to look at it into any kind of real actuality, that would be a very, very complicated and long discussion. But it's of course absolutely crucial, crucial issue, which museums are extremely aware of, more and more actually, because museums used to be sort of deposits. And even very often, around 1900, for the cemeteries. And now they are not thought of, they are much more thought of as schools or as stores or all kinds of things, but certainly not cemeteries anymore.
Did you have a last thought? Yeah.
No, I don't know if it's the last one, what it's going to look like. I was just thinking, it really crossed my mind, because I was thinking a lot on the question of how we destroy value today. And I was going back to Bataille's argument of thinking on the Second World War as the biggest potlatch in the 20th century. And I sort of thought that in the same way that we have this exacerbation in art and in charity of the display of wealth that accompanies the secrecy or the invisibility of accumulation, we also have a new phenomenon, and it's how distant war is becoming the place where we are displaying destruction in a massive scale. So there's a certain sense in which the need of replacing, of actually consuming, that has to occur in a different way than having constant crises, because they attempt to prevent the moment of collapse by futures and derivatives actually reaches a point where it's impossible to displace all those accumulated resources in a way to hide the fact that nobody is consuming. It's accompanied by this other moment of the display of destruction. And somehow I was thinking that we need to understand that these phenomena are connected in a metaphorical way, that we have an enormous amount of resources that are publicly being destroyed, perceived as like a bonfire by all of us. And it's an enormous amount of labor that is just being destroyed. At the same time, you have other places where you have an enormous ostentative presentation of accumulation, like Chinese cities or Indian cities, that they are the moments of display of this accumulation. So somehow, the way in which artworks and collections are used to be the central pieces through which you saw those processes is becoming a little bit obsolete, because this display in the new emerging powers is not happening through these collections. They have a minor role, differently from France, where in reality something like the Louvre really represented this enormous capitalist prosperity.
Okay, I think that on that note, we'll come to a kind of end, because I think this has been such a wonderful conversation where life and death and accumulation and destruction, the undead, and there's been a nice taut tension, and there's been nice moments of exhilaration, and that's wonderful. And I was very delighted that one of my favorite thinkers who sometimes get a short shrift, Friedrich Engels, was brought out, because he's an interesting man, and he in a text called Anti-Düring, which gets a lot of bad press these days, he used a phrase called the counted uncountables. And it's a kind of polemic he's having with a guy called Max Stirner. But this business of the counted uncountable, of not being able to count for things that are accumulating within us, perhaps might be a kind of note to end on. Thank you very much.